Quite fitting for that song to be led right before this particular lesson, as it seems to work out so well so many times. But still, it is good to be able to be here this morning. It's good to be able to look to the Bible. Give me the Bible, that holy message shining. And if we look at the different verses, each one talks about a different situation or spot in life that we might be at, and in all cases, give us that Bible. And this morning's lesson, the crumbs that build faith. Also ironic that today is a fellowship meal as well. So stick around for that, and maybe we'll have more than just crumbs at fellowship, but we'll get back to the crumbs here in a second. John chapter 6, starting at verse 28. Then they said to him, "What shall we do that we may work the works of God?" A question being given to Christ. And so Jesus answers and said to them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent." Therefore they said to him, "What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do? Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Then Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives it to the world." Then they said to him, "Lord, give us this bread always." And Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." And he continues on with more words and teaching, but to stop right there to give us the point of the starting spot. When we have the bread of life, he has given the bread of life. Christ came to the earth for us. Yes, those of the Old Testament wandering in the wilderness, they had the manna that came down, but yet that just fed for a period. Christ is now the bread of life. When we take and partake of the bread, when we take and cut a loaf of bread, we will have crumbs that fall off of it. And we see how these crumbs can still serve a purpose. A lot of times at home, if I cut a piece of bread and I have crumbs, I kind of flick them off the table, or we clear them off. But yet we'll get to that point as we get further in the lesson as to what these crumbs can have. And speaking metaphorically or kind of in a parable-like sense, the bread, the crumbs, what we do with them, has a meaning behind it all. Let's look at that as if, that is the idea. We see physically this bread, we see physically these items, but yet, do we see it spiritually? Do we see Christ as the bread of life? He is the full and whole loaf given to us from heaven. What do we do with it? We can't take it all in one piece. We have to take it in bite-sized pieces. And so when we take it in bite-sized pieces, crumbs are still there. We have crumbs available to us and to others. At what stage are we at? I stop and think about a little bit of reminiscing, a little bit, if you will, of growing up. You've got the big table, and then you got the kids' table. When we take and get set up, how many of us were so excited to go sit at the kids' table? But we got the big table over here. I want to sit at the big table. I'm thinking about even our Sunday morning Bible studies as we look at the progression of the house of Israel going into Egypt, and we see this in Genesis 43 verses 31 to 33, where it says, "Then he washed his face, came out and restrained himself, and said, 'Serve the bread.' Joseph comes back out after he had teared up. He had to go wash his face, and he comes back out and says, 'It's time to eat. Serve the bread.' So they set a place by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves. because Egyptians could not eat the food with the Hebrews, for that was an abomination to the Egyptians. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked in astonishment at one another. We see the tables are being set. The leader, Joseph, of this house of almost the entire land, he's number 2 in the land, is set by himself as leader. He was not an Egyptian, so the Egyptians did not sit with him, so they had their own table. And then the house of Israel, the brothers sat by themselves. They set them in a side room almost, as it were. As the picture I get from this is that they set them over because it would be wrong to eat with them by their customs. And so we have multiple tables that we're sitting at. Do we not sometimes see where we are sitting has an importance to it? When we take and sit down at the table, if I, as a little kid, try to jump up on the big table, the parent would say, "Get over there, kid." I'd be kicked out of my spot because it was never my spot in the first place. That was just my dreams and hopes to sit at the big table, hear the adult conversations, even though I had no clue what was going on most of the time, and then be able to eat the better foods maybe. They got the bigger, better selections up there. I got the leftovers. I had the kids' meal. Here you go. Have some mac and cheese instead of the big stuff at the big table. Now, don't get me wrong. I like my mac and cheese. I still do. But the idea of sitting at the table, getting up to that level of importance. Jesus even talks about it a little bit in Luke chapter 14 when you're invited to a wedding feast, don't presume yourself to be the guest of honor. Let the host bring you up to that position, lest you be pushed back down. So where we sit does have an importance. It does have a position. And sometimes we get to elevate up. Perhaps I come in and I start off at the kids' table, but ooh, look at this. Not as many adults showed up. Maybe I'm one of the older kids and now I get to be brought up to the adults' table instead of the other way around where I get my head swatted and say, "Get back down there." At some point, we get to move up. Do we desire that move? Do we desire to be able to go up from this card table that got thrown together with mismatched chairs or whatever we had to do, and hopefully there were enough chairs around and you didn't have to share it with someone, to all of a sudden you're at the big table. You have your own seat. And eventually you get included in the conversation. I remember moving up to the table and I was just kind of at the table. I got my own spot. I had a little bit of elbow room, had all this food, but yet I wasn't in the conversation yet. And then you get added into the conversation. And now you're at the big table. Back in the time with Joseph and the Egyptians and the guests, we're at the table. There's the starting spot. Sometimes we think, well, if I was only at that table. But are we at a table? They're already there. They're in a spot. Eventually we get to move up. And there is a progression to it. As we start to look at the process, we see in 1 Peter chapter 2, he talks about us desiring that. It's okay sometimes to desire more than what we have. A lot of times we look at the sins of that, of how that's a bad thing, but today we get to look at when we want more is okay. 1 Peter chapter 2 starts off saying, "Therefore lay aside all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all evil speaking." And here's the big part. "As newborn babes, desire the pure milk of the word, that you may grow thereby. If indeed you have tasted that the Lord is gracious." As newborn babes, they desire some milk. They want the nourishment. They want to be fed. They want to grow. Do we still want that? Physically, I know that here in a little bit I will be hungry and will want to eat and will be very pleased to engage in fellowship with one another down the hall in the fellowship room and add food into my body. Our prayer this morning had an emphasis in it that said that we are here and looking forward to hearing the Word of God. Is that in our hearts? Is that something that we seek after, just as this newborn babe desires the pure milk of the Word? Try and give that babe a pacifier when it wants milk, and what do you get? A little bit of a fuss. They want milk, and we give them something else, and they let you know about it. Do we as Christians, as people seeking after God, want His Word like this newborn babe? Do we want to move from the kids' table up to the big table? Do we want to be able to be elevated and move forward? Do we desire it? Do we feel accomplished when we do move up? Sometimes we want to, try and stay so humble that we don't acknowledge that, but do we acknowledge our successes? Eventually that little babe, that newborn babe, has to have something more than just milk. Has to get more than just that, and we start to introduce a little bit more. So the question is, are the crumbs really that important? Since there's a progression to it, since we have to work our way up, we sometimes have to stop and think. We get an idea about the crumbs. Matthew chapter 15, and this is where the idea of the crumbs really comes from, is that a woman comes to Christ and asks for something. Now Christ is going through His ministry, giving to anyone who asks freely according to their faith, but all of a sudden this woman here is from outside. She's not of the nation of Israel. She is outside of the nation. She is of an area that they consider to be less desirable. Think back to Joseph when the Egyptians would not eat with the Israelites because it would be an abomination. Fast forward to this point in time when Jesus is walking around and the Canaanites are considered an abomination by the Jews, by the Israelite nation. We have a very similar setup coming up here. And so as we look at this, we think about the culture. We think about what's going on. And chapter 15, starting in verse 21. Then Jesus went out and departed from the region of Tyre and Sidon, and behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." But he answered her not a word. Not unusual for the culture of the time. It's kind of unusual for Christ Himself, but yet He's also following culture right now and has a point to be made. And His disciples came and urged Him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries after us." But He answered and said, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." We looked at the verse earlier where He said, "I am the bread of life that my Father has given to you." And so now He is confirming, I am here to the house of Israel. He is following the laws of the nation. He is fulfilling those laws. She was persistent. She still came and worshiped Him, saying, "Lord, help me." The test comes in this next verse, but He answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." Imagine if you were back at the feast and you're sitting at the kids' table and you have a plate of food, and then all of a sudden the parent comes over and says, "I'm still hungry," and starts taking away your food. Or takes your food and throws it on the floor. Is that good for the child's nourishment? As we progress our way up, the child needs nourishment too, and the child has food. What if we just start taking your food and throwing it down on the floor? Christ said He has come to the nation of Israel. He has come to deliver the food to the people that need it, and yet to take that away from them could hurt them. How much faith would we have? How much resolve would we have if we were this woman? This woman had a determination, and she went forward and said, she said, "Yes, Lord." She recognizes that he has come to the nation of Israel. She is teaching them primarily. But she says, "Yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from the master's table." There are still leftovers. When you break the bread and the crumbs fall off, you don't give the crumbs to the children, you give the pieces of bread to them. May I have the crumbs? You're just going to sling them off of the table and let the dogs start to eat them or lick them up. May I have the crumbs? Jesus answered and said to her, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire." And her daughter was healed that very hour. Do we have that faith? If you just got called a dog and said that I am not here for you, where's your faith? Where is my faith? Where is our thought process going? This was a norm for them. It was something that they expected. So for us to just go out and insult somebody, they knew, they felt it. You had the nation of Israel, and then you kind of had those Samaritans over there. You had the Canaanites. You had all these other nations. God is with the people of Israel, and Christ has come to the nation of Israel. But yet they said, "Can we get the crumbs from off the table?" You're not going to eat them. Very seldom do I take and start picking up all the crumbs and eat every last crumb that's on my table. I eat the bulk of it, and the crumbs go to the dog. Literally, I've got a dog that loves that. I have a cat that likes it too. When it's a nice and toasted bread or something, they'll eat those little pieces and morsels. What do we do with the crumbs? She realizes that she is not at the master's table, and she is not asserting herself like the person at the wedding feast who thinks of themselves to be a place of honor. She knows that she is part of a nation, of a culture, of a group of people that is known for their sin. Perhaps her herself is engaged in some. We don't know. We just know that she is seeking after Christ. I think that tells us something about her character just in itself, and that she is humble enough to reach outside and say, "Lord, help me. Give me the crumbs to get started on." We look for the crumbs. We want those elements. And so Christ delivers the word, the bread of life, to those that are at the table. He says the bread, the big pieces are for here. You're not ready for the big pieces yet. But yet, you can have the crumbs. Start with the crumbs. Pave the way for what is to come. As we start looking at this is not a new case. This woman is not alone. She is just one of many. I've got 3 different examples here for us to be able to go back and study and look at. But Christ gave crumbs to those that are not at the table throughout his ministry. The Samaritan woman at the well, when he came up and said, "I thirst," and she drew him some water, and they had a conversation, and she went back to the village and said how much this man was. The centurion who sought him out and said, "I have a servant who is paralyzed." The centurion who said that I am a man of authority just as you. All we have to do is say the words and it is done. He had the faith. And then this Canaanite woman as well. Just 3 examples that Christ came to seek the lost. Primarily to the house of Israel, because that was the primary mission field at this time, but knowing that it would branch out into all areas. As he tells his disciples, in Jerusalem, Judea, to Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. It would spread so that even we have access. The meat, the chunk of bread is for those that are at the table. But there are still scraps. What do we do with our scraps? What do we do with our leftovers? Sometimes we have to remember there is that progression. We have to be mindful of what we have. When we learn to eat, we go from milk to crumbs to solid food. As we go from the small table to big table, we can grow and take in more. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 12, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles, the oracles of God. You have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of the milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason of time have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. There's a progression. We work our way up. Now, we desire the sincere milk of the word. That is not to say that this part here is that if we drink milk at a meal, then we're little kids. We need to be able to take the bigger steps. But we also need to realize, too, perhaps this Canaanite woman, the nation of Canaan, and all these other nations were not ready for the meat at the master's table. They had to start with the crumbs. They had to start with the little introductions. Just as if we were to go out to the streets, go to our neighbors. Are they ready for the meat of the Word? How long have we been studying the Word? Each person is a different spot in our journey. We each have a different understanding of the Scriptures, and we build from that point forward. We start with the crumbs. We start with the ability to look at what is at our table. What table are we sitting at? Do we have the big chunks? Do we have the bite-sized pieces? Do we have the crumbs? Are we desiring what we have and to move up to the next level? When we are at the table, which table are we? Are we helping to encourage one another to continue the journey forward and upward? Do we help the next one down? What do we have at the child's table who can't use a fork and knife yet, and all we have is a big chunk right there? What do we do to that child? Do we just drop that big chunk down and just expect them to eat it? Let's say it's a baked potato or a piece of meat, something like that. It's a nice chunk. What do? We cut it up for them. We put them in bite-sized pieces so that they can take it in. We don't try and tell them to eat an entire baked potato in one piece. They can't even grab that thing. We know how to use our utensils, so we are able to use it for ourselves and take that in. So what do we do for the next person? Do we help them? Do we share our leftovers? Do we share the crumbs with those who are without? For those that aren't able to absorb what Christ is or won't accept who He is, maybe we give them crumbs. Maybe those crumbs come in the form of our generosity, of our loving nature day by day, our actions. Said it's kind of like a parable. I'm speaking about food, but what are our actions? Do we take and go day by day and help others? Part of that is leaving a bread trail. That little crumb trail. Got that in a storybook a little bit about leaving little pieces of bread so you can find your way home. You might turn around and find out you have a crew of critters following you, looking for the next dropping. Don't try and leave a bread trail in the back of Gary and Anna's yard. You're not going to find the trail. You'll find a bunch of chickens following you, eating every piece that you drop. But that's okay too, because what is that bread doing? Feeding someone else. Are we helping another along the pathway? Are we growing ourselves and continuing to desire more? In this case, it is good to desire more. Desire the sincere milk of God. The words of God, let us enrich our lives with it, and let us use it to enrich others. If there's anyone that needs the crumbs that come off of the Master's table from God Himself, if there's anyone that would like help in moving up to more solid foods, anyone that would like help in any way, let your needs be known. We offer the invitation while together we stand and sing.